So I've been talking about doing this for a while, but it's holiday time, and I figure that today's a good day to start. We'll be talking about some holiday baking basics. First off, step one, don't go on an empty stomach. Step two, don't try to bake in a dirty kitchen. This is disgusting and needs to be cleaned up first. My mother would be ashamed. Clean kitchen. Time to get started on the baking. Alright, let's talk butter. Most baking recipes for the holidays especially are going to require some form of oil, which would be butter. Personally recommend not skimping on the butter itself. Instead of buying cheap off-brand butter from the store, if you can get a slightly nicer French butter or Irish butter, it's generally much better as far as the flavor is going to come out. If you are in a pinch or don't have the extra funds, off-brand butter works just fine. Just try to avoid margarine unless specifically called for in the recipe that you're using. In this particular case, I'm going to be baking a cake today. It's going to be a golden layer cake. We're going to be playing with some fondant later, but I probably won't show that piece. We're just going to go with the basic baking today. Starting off with 10 tablespoons of butter that I'm going to soften in the microwave on the soften setting. Butter is going in the microwave. And I'm going to turn it on soften. The next few ingredients are pretty self-explanatory. I've got 9 ounces of flour, roughly 2 cups. I'm using cake flour. Cake flour tends to be a little bit finer cut than regular flour. It also generally just bakes better when it comes to cakes. It makes them more cakey, I guess that's a word. The rest of the ingredients are pretty self-explanatory, like I said. We also have 1 1/4 cup sugar by weight, 4 whole medium eggs, or 3 large eggs plus 1 egg yolk if you're using large eggs instead. We also have 1 teaspoon of vanilla. I've also added 2.5 teaspoons of baking powder to the flour directly, as well as 1/4 teaspoon of salt. To be clear, this is a half teaspoon, so half of that of salt. When it comes to salt, I generally suggest kosher salt as opposed to iodized salt or the salt that comes in the jars at the store, as the flavor is much different, much simpler, and just salt as opposed to the mild aftertaste that iodized salt can have. Last but not least, 3/4 cup of milk. Generally shouldn't use anything less than 2%. If you're using skim milk for a baking recipe, I honestly don't know what you do with it because I've never actually tried. Generally 2 or 4% or whole milk. We're going to place the softened butter into the cream or the mixer. Brand new mixer, just got it for my birthday. Pretty excited about it. We're going to go ahead and bring that up and we're going to cream this. Once it's broken apart really well, we're going to go ahead and add the 1 1/4 cups of sugar and we're going to let that whip together for a couple minutes. And this is what happens when your butter is not softened enough. Fix that mistake. I scraped it back out into the bowl I was using to soften it originally and put it back in the microwave on another soften setting. Second time's a charm. Now as the butter is beating there with the sugar and really kind of turning into a paste, I'm going to go ahead and start adding eggs one at a time. We're going to do this until all the eggs have been beaten in. Once all the eggs have been added, we have this nice smooth texture. Now we add the vanilla. And we let that beat for a moment. Oven is preheating to 350 degrees, and I'm going to grease 2 small cake pans. Greasing your cake pans, I generally like to use parchment paper as part of the process, but instead of just using butter, personally I like to use just a drop of olive oil in the bottom before I actually add the parchment paper to the top. This helps create a seal around the actual edges. So we're just going to use that. I'm going to smear it around really well and then get it on the sides as well. Cut my parchment paper as needed, and then butter the top of the parchment paper itself. The reason why I generally use olive oil to put on the bottom of the pan before the parchment paper is largely because I find that the oil itself makes a better seal with the parchment paper. It lasts longer. Butter tends to start to brown and separate a little bit as it's being cooked, and especially with that being closest to the heat, I want to make sure that it lasts the longest. Parchment paper has been put in the pan It's also been buttered, and I cut off the excess stuff on the outside. I cut it down to about the top of the pan. One of the things you're going to notice if you use parchment paper is that as the cake cooks, you'll actually see any of these wrinkles that exist in the pan itself on your cake. For me, for my purpose today, that's not going to be an issue, just because I'm actually going to be using fondant as well to actually cover the cake and then decorate it. If you're just making a regular cake that you're just going to put frosting on, it's questionable as to whether or not that's an issue. It really just depends on your design style that you're looking for. You can use just the cake pan itself, but once again, I prefer parchment paper because it makes it easier to release, even though I have one of the side released pans. Just personal preference. And once again, it's going to be covered in frosting and fondant, so who really gives a fuck? Alternating a little bit of the flour mixture with the salt and baking soda with the milk as I poured it in, starting to get a nice batter forming at the bottom. I'm just going to give that a couple more moments to beat. I'm about to shut off the mixer and scrape the sides so that the rest of the flour incorporates into the cake mixture. Do not overbeat your cake mixture. Once it's actually pretty smooth, we're going to want to go ahead and turn it off so that it doesn't start to form gluten too fast, which is going to cause the cake to actually get really heavy. Cake batter is generally distributed over 1 to 2 pans, depending on what your final outcome is supposed to be. And then put in the 350-degree oven until it's done. That can vary depending on how deep your cake pans are and whether or not you use a single or a double. Okay, here's the outcome. I'll be honest, it actually took more like 55 minutes. Alas, that's what happens when you're working from scratch. These are the dents I was talking about from the parchment paper. It can actually turn out to be a really cool pattern depending on how you do it, and if you're careful or not, it makes a pretty nifty flower pattern. That being said, it's supposed to be 2 layers high. I gave up after half, just because company showed up, and, well, I'm fucking lazy. Also, if I'm being honest, it's probably not going to get frosted. Bitches will be drunk, so they'll enjoy it anyway. Merry Christmas!